The trunks went up the east staircase before breakfast, and by noon every servant in the house had decided whose they were. Marianne, Duchess of Caro these 4 months and mistress of nothing so much as her own composure, counted them from the gallery window and did not trust her hands enough to hold her tea while she did it. 6 trunks, 1 hatbox, and a leather case carried by the housekeeper herself, rather than trusted to a footman, though it was not heavy enough to need the care it was given. She did not yet know that the woman riding up from the village in the closed carriage carried, in that plain leather case, the only proof that would save her husband's life. Had she known, she would have gone down into the yard and carried it up herself, 2 flights, and not minded the weight at all. What she knew instead was what the second housemaid had told the underbutler, who had told Mrs. Pratt, who had told her with the particular gentleness reserved for breaking a bone cleanly rather than letting it set crooked. A lady was coming to stay in the East Wing, by His Grace's own order, and she was not to be announced to callers, and her meals were to go up on a separate tray, and no one, not even the Duchess, was to trouble her rest. Marianne set down her cup without a sound. She had learned, in 4 months of marriage to a man who had married her, the way a merchant settles an account that must be settled before quarter day, that the loudest grief in this house was the kind that never raised its voice. The trunks went up. The door of the East Wing, disused since the old Duke's time, was opened, aired, and shut again with a new lock fitted to it by a man from the village who was paid in silver and told to forget the house he had visited. Marianne watched all of this from a window with a ledger open on the sill in front of her, because the household accounts did not stop needing her, merely because her husband had apparently found something else to spend himself on. She was 26, plain by the standard of the county and unashamed of it, and she had married Julian Ashgrove, Duke of Caro, for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with her father's debts and his own need for a wife who could be produced quickly, without scandal, before a rumor could finish killing him faster than whatever was actually trying to. That was the joke of it, though no one in the house was laughing. The Duke of Caro was said to be dying. Not of any wound the surgeons could name. He had come home from the war 4 years past with a bad leg and a worse silence, and both had seemed to heal, but of something newer. Something that had begun in the spring with headaches he did not mention, and hands that shook at breakfast in a way he covered by holding his coffee cup in both of them, as a colder man warms his fingers. Marianne had married him in June in a ceremony attended by 11 people and a solicitor, precisely because a healthy young wife, visibly expected to give the house an heir, was the fastest answer available to a rumor that his cousin's branch of the family was already, discreetly, pricing the estate. She had not expected love. She had expected civility, an allowance, and the quiet use of a mind that had spent 19 years balancing her father's ruinous accounts and had been told by no one, not once, that this made her valuable. She had not expected trunks going up a locked staircase 4 months into her marriage, and a woman inside them nobody would name. Mrs. Pratt found her still at the window an hour later, the ledger unmarked. The keys at the housekeeper's belt gave a small, dry chime as she set down a second tray she had not been asked to bring. "You'll take your dinner up here tonight, Your Grace, I think," she said, in the voice of a woman who had decided a thing was true before anyone had confirmed it to her, which was, in this house, usually the safest way to be right. "I had rather take it downstairs, as I always do," Marianne said. "I had rather you didn't tonight, Mrs." Pratt did not elaborate, and did not need to. The offer of privacy was itself the information. Marianne looked at the tray, and then at the housekeeper's face, weathered and honest and giving away nothing it had not already decided to give. "Is she very beautiful, then?" Marianne asked, and heard how flat her own voice had gone, the flatness she used instead of the thing underneath it. I couldn't say, Your Grace. I've not seen her face. She travels veiled. How discreet of her. I, said Mrs. Pratt, and there was something in the single word that was not quite agreement, though Marianne was too tired that first evening to hear it for what it was. A house does not lie, Mrs. Pratt told her once, weeks later, when the whole business had unraveled far enough to be spoken of. Only the people in it do. But that evening the house told her nothing except that a new lock had been fitted. And a woman had arrived without a face, and her husband had not come to explain either. He came instead at 9, when the light was going copper over the park, and the rooks were arguing themselves to sleep in the elms, and he stood in the doorway of her sitting room with his hand closed hard around the signet ring he always turned, when he was about to say a thing he had already decided not to feel sorry for. Mrs. Voss will be residing in the East Wing until further notice, he said, without preamble, the way he said everything, as though sentences cost him something, and he preferred to pay quickly. You are not to concern yourself with her comfort. The staff have their instructions. I had gathered as much, Marianne said, from the staff, since you did not think to tell me yourself. Something moved behind his eyes, there and gone, like a fish under ice. It does not concern you. I am your wife. It does not concern you, he said again, gentler this time, which was somehow worse, and I will ask you not to press it. There is a great deal riding on the appearance of an ordinary autumn in this house, madam, and I would take it as a kindness if you gave me that appearance without requiring my reasons. And if I require them regardless, then you will be disappointed, he said, as I am told wives frequently are. He left before she could answer that, which was, she was coming to understand, his particular gift, the ability to end a conversation by simply refusing to remain inside it. She sat a long while after the door closed, turning the ledger's pages without reading them, and thought of the one fact he had let drop without meaning to, the way a man drops a coin from a torn pocket and does not notice the loss until later. An ordinary autumn. There was a season already named for this, a shape already drawn around it, and somewhere at the far edge of that shape. She would learn within the week, sat the harvest ball 6 weeks off, when the county would come to Cairo to see with its own eyes whether the Duke was dying, and the family's trustee, a dry, meticulous man named Mr. Trevanion, would sit down with the household books on the quarter day that followed it and satisfy himself, once and for all, that the Duke of Cairo was fit to keep his own house in his own hands. 6 weeks. She did not yet know how much would have to be paid, and by whom, before that day came. But she wrote the date in the corner of her ledger that night, the way she wrote every debt that would eventually have to be reckoned, and underlined it once. She did not raise the matter with him again for 4 days, which was, she privately admitted, 4 days longer than her pride had ever asked her to hold anything. It was Mrs. Pratt who finally supplied her with what passed in that house for backstory, delivered not as history, but as a kind of inventory taken while polishing silver. Because the housekeeper did not believe in giving a person a story sitting down when she could give it to them working. Marianne had come to Cairo with one trunk of her own, a mind for figures her father had called unbecoming in a daughter, and then leaned on ruinously for a decade, and a face the county considered unremarkable enough that 3 separate matrons had, in her hearing, expressed surprise that the Duke had chosen her over prettier candidates with better portions. She had not corrected them. She had learned early that being underestimated was a kind of shelter, the way a low doorway keeps out weather that would flatten a taller house, and she had built her whole self around staying inside it. Small things kept small go unnoticed, she told herself the first week of her marriage, watching her husband's face across a silent breakfast table for some sign he had married more than a signature. That is their use. Mrs. Pratt, buffing a candlestick with more force than the candlestick required, told her the rest without being asked. The old Duke, Julian's father, had died 8 years past, and Julian had gone to war the following spring more from grief than duty, by the housekeeper's account, and come home from it with the leg and the silence Marianne had already noted, and something else besides, a habit of trusting almost no one with the running of his own house. Because the one person he had trusted with it while he was away, his father's cousin's widow, a Mrs. Lucretia Vane, had run it so smoothly and so long that she had never quite been asked to stop. "She keeps the accounts still, does she?" Marianne said. "Not quite a question. She keeps a great many things," said Mrs. Pratt, and set the candlestick down with a small definite click, corner to base, the way she set down anything she did not wish to discuss further that day. It was Julian himself, oddly, who gave her the fuller shape of it 2 evenings later, in the one conversation of that first fortnight that did not end with him leaving the room. She had gone down to the estate office after supper to correct an error in the tenant rents that had been troubling her for a week. An error of £11 4 that appeared in one column and vanished from another with no note explaining where it had gone, and she found him there already, standing over the same ledger with a candle burned down to its collar, his hand closed around the ring, not turning it now, but simply holding it, the way a man holds a rail on a ship in weather he will not admit is bad. "You keep late hours for a duke," she said, before she could decide whether saying anything was wise. "You keep them for a woman who was told the books were not her concern. They were never said to be yours either. And yet—" He did not smile, quite, but something in his jaw eased a fraction, the smallest thaw she had seen in him since the church. "I keep the books because someone in this house must, and because I find I trust figures more than I trust most of the people who report them to me." "A fair policy," she said, "so long as the figures themselves are honest." "They are not always," he said, and for a moment she thought he meant to say more, meant to hand her the whole of it there, standing in candlelight with the ring gone still in his fist, but a log shifted in the grate, loud as a door, and whatever had been rising in him closed over again like water over a dropped stone. "Go to bed, Duchess," he said instead. "The rents will keep till morning." "I keep the books," she said, not moving, surprising herself with the steadiness of it. "I do not keep secrets. I find I do both badly when I am made to guess at the second while doing the first." He looked at her a long moment, the candle guttering between them, and she thought, not for the first time, that his stillness was not emptiness at all, but a kind of weight, a held breath 4 years long. "Then we are both to be pitied," he said finally, "for I keep little else." He left the £11 4 unexplained, and the woman in the east wing unnamed, and Marianne went up to bed with the distinct, uncomfortable sense that she had just watched a man decide, for the second time that week, not to trust her with the truth, and that some other, colder part of her had noted, filed, and did not intend to forget, that he had wanted to. The gossip did not wait for permission to grow, and by the second week of Mrs. Voss's residence it had put out roots into every room of the house that Marianne entered. Callers came as callers do, with sympathy sharpened to a fine edge and questions dressed as concern. Lady Fenhallow's daughter, a cool ornamental creature named Honora Blake, who had, before Marianne's hasty marriage, been the county's settled favorite to become the next Duchess of Carow, made a particular art of it over tea in the yellow drawing-room, turning her fan slowly closed and open. Closed and open, while she spoke. "It is very modern of you, Your Grace, to bear it all so calmly," Honora said. "I do not know that I could, were a companion installed under my own roof, with my own husband's name on the lease of her rooms, so to speak. I was not aware roofs came with leases, Marianne said, or I should have negotiated harder for mine. A ripple of laughter went round the room that was not entirely kind to Honora, who did not care for it and pressed on regardless, her voice gentling into something meant to sound like pity. They say she was seen at his study window past midnight. My maid had it from a girl in your own kitchens. Your maid should choose her sources more carefully, Marianne said, as should you, and was rewarded by the sight of Honora's fan snapping fully shut, which was as close to a retreat as the girl was willing to make in front of witnesses. It was a small victory, and Marianne knew it for one, the way she knew the difference between a ledger that balanced and a ledger that had merely been made to look as though it did. But it cost her something to keep her face so level while the wager book at the village inn. She would learn later from a red-faced groom too honest to lie to her directly, had already opened on how many months the marriage would survive. She kept small. She kept her hands folded. She went that evening, on no pretext she could afterward explain even to herself, up the east stair for the first time since the Trunks had climbed it, and stood outside the new lock with her candle guttering in the draught, and heard, through the door, not laughter, not a lover's murmur, but the steady, rhythmic scrape of something being ground in a bowl, round and round, patient as a mill wheel, and under it a woman's voice, low and unhurried, speaking words Marianne could not make out, but whose cadence was entirely wrong for seduction and entirely right for instruction. The cadence, though she did not know it yet, of a woman teaching a recipe to someone taking careful notes. She stood there long enough that the candle guttered twice, and might have knocked had a step not sounded on the stair below her, unhurried, deliberate, a footfall she had already learned to know in the dark. Julian did not ask what she was doing there. He looked at the door, and then at her, and something crossed his face that was not anger, though anger would have been easier to answer. "You should not be on this stair," he said quietly. "Then tell me why, and I need never trouble it again." Marianne, it was the first time he had used her given name since the church, and it landed in her chest with more weight than she had prepared for. "I am asking you to trust a thing you cannot see the shape of." "I know it is not a fair thing to ask a wife. I am asking it regardless, because the alternative costs more than my pride, and I have very little of that left to spend in any case." "You forget," she said, "that I am rather good at keeping accounts I cannot fully see the shape of. It is, in fact, the only thing anyone in this family has ever thought me useful for." Something almost like a laugh moved through him, gone before it fully arrived, the ghost of a thing rather than the thing itself, and she filed that too, without knowing yet that she was building a private ledger of her own, one column for what he said, and another, growing longer by the week. For what his stillness told her, he did not. Lucretia Vane came to Cairo for the first time that Marianne witnessed on a Tuesday bright, with early autumn cold, arriving in a carriage newer than the Duke's own, dressed in silk the color of a plum just past ripe, smelling of orange flower water strong enough to precede her into a room by several seconds. She was, by any honest measure, beautiful, the kind of beauty that had been maintained rather than merely inherited, every hair accounted for, every seam pressed, and she took Marianne's hand in both of hers with a warmth so complete it was very nearly convincing. "The new Duchess," she said, in a voice pitched low and soft, the gentlest voice in any room she entered, which Marianne would only later learn to read correctly. "How glad I am, at last." Julian writes so little of his own happiness, one begins to wonder if he has any to report. "He has been occupied," Marianne said. "Yes," Lucretia said, and smoothed one glove, finger by finger, an unhurried, contented gesture. He has been occupied a great while now, hasn't he? Ever since his father passed, I have told him, someone must keep the wheels turning while he grieves, and grieve he does, poor boy, in his own quiet way. I only ever wished to spare him the burden of the books until he was equal to them again. He seems quite equal to them now, Marianne said pleasantly. I have watched him at them myself, some nights past midnight. Something flickered behind Lucretia's eyes, there and controlled before Marianne could be certain she had seen it at all. How industrious of him, Lucretia said, and touched the pearl at her throat once, the smallest adjustment, as if resettling a weight. You must forgive an old woman her habits, Your Grace. I have kept this house's accounts so long I sometimes forget they are not mine to keep. I shall have my figures brought over for you to review, if it would ease your mind, though I warn you, they make very dull reading. Rents and physic bills and the tediousness of a great house eating its way through a year. I find figures rarely dull, Marianne said. Depending, I suppose, on what they are made to hide. She said it lightly, testing the weight of it in the air the way one tests ice before trusting a foot to it, and watched Lucretia's smile hold perfectly steady, not a hair's width of strain in it, which told her more than any flinch could have done. How clever you are, Lucretia said warmly. Julian always did prefer clever women, when he allowed himself to prefer anything at all. It was later that same afternoon, while a footman carried out the tea things, that Marianne noticed the ledger Lucretia had brought sitting unattended on the side table, its ribbon loosened as though it had been consulted more than once already that visit, and beside it, tucked half under the blotter, a small brown apothecary's bottle, empty. Its paper label soaked and peeled at one corner so that only half a word remained legible upon it, a fragment that meant nothing to her that day and everything to her within the month. She did not touch it. She only looked and remembered, the way she remembered every figure that failed to add, and set it in the growing column of things that did not yet make sense but would not be permitted to stay that way forever. Her allies, when she came to count them honestly, amounted to exactly 2, and she had not chosen either so much as they had simply refused to leave her side. Mrs. Pratt was the first and most reliable, blunt as a kitchen knife and twice as useful, who told Marianne plainly one evening over the mending, "I've kept this house's linen closets since before you were born, Your Grace, and I'll tell you the one thing 30 years teaches a body. The loudest scandal in a house is very rarely the true one. It's only ever the one somebody wanted you looking at. And what is the true one, in your 30 years' opinion?" "That," said Mrs. Pratt, biting off a thread with more satisfaction than the task required, "is above my wages to say. But I'll tell you this for nothing, Mrs. Voss up in the East Wing eats less than a sparrow, sleeps less than a soldier on watch, and has not once asked this house for a single luxury a real mistress would have had off his Grace inside a fortnight. No jewels, no carriage of her own, no new gowns. A kept woman who wants nothing kept is no kept woman I've ever heard tell of." Marianne turned that over for days before the second ally arrived to hand her the piece that made it click into a shape. It happened by accident, or what she took for accident at the time, a torn hem, mended badly, that sent her up the back stair toward the sewing room rather than the front, past the foot of the East Wing stair at an hour she was not meant to be there, where she came upon a boy of perhaps 16, a still-room lad named Peter Sims, crouched at the bottom step with a covered tray in his hands and a look on his face like a man caught between 2 masters, neither of whom he dared disappoint. "You've dropped nothing, I hope," she said, more gently than she felt, because his hands were shaking hard enough that the covered cup on the tray was chattering against its saucer. "No, Your Grace. He would not meet her eyes, only his Grace's evening tonic. I'm to carry it up to Mrs. Voss first, before it goes to him. Those are my instructions. From whom? From, he stopped himself so abruptly it was its own answer, tugging hard at his cuff, once, twice, a nervous habit she would come to recognize the way a card player learns another man's tell. From the housekeeper, Your Grace. As is proper, it was not proper, and they both knew it, and Marianne let him go without pressing further, only because pressing a frightened boy on an open stair was not, she judged, the way to get at a truth this carefully buried. But she stood a long while after he had gone, turning the fact over the way she turned every column that failed to balance. A tonic, carried first to the woman in the East Wing before it ever reached the husband it was meant to steady. A woman who ate like a sparrow and slept like a sentry and wanted nothing a mistress would want. An empty bottle with a soaked label under Lucretia Vane's own blotter. Figures rarely lie, she thought, standing on the cold stair with her candle burning low. It is only ever the people reporting them. And somewhere above her, faint through the new lock on the new door, came again that patient, circular grinding, round and round, a woman's low, unhurried voice teaching something to no one Marianne could see, and for the first time since the trunks had gone up that staircase, she understood that she had been reading the whole story backward, and that the thing she had been dreading to find in that locked room was not a rival for her husband's heart at all, but something with a far colder shape and far more dangerous teeth. The evening she was finally admitted into the East Wing came without warning, 3 weeks into the arrangement, when Julian himself knocked at her sitting room door past 10 o'clock with his coat still on and an expression she had not yet seen him wear. Not the grave stillness he kept for the household, nor the careful courtesy he kept for callers, but something rawer, closer to the surface. Like a man who has been holding a weight so long his arms have simply stopped registering the strain until the moment he sets it down. I should like you to meet Mrs. Voss, he said without preamble, if you are willing. I find I no longer have the strength to keep this from you and manage the rest of it besides, and I would rather you heard it from me, tonight. Then pieced it together from servants' talk and drew the wrong conclusion in the dark. I have been drawing conclusions in the dark for 3 weeks, she said, rising. I should be glad of a candle. He almost smiled at that, the ghost again, quicker to appear now than it had been in June, she noted, and set that observation too into its column, and led her up the east stair himself, past the new lock, into a room that smelled not of scent or silk, but of dried lavender and vinegar, and something bitter underneath both, herbal and medicinal, the smell of a still room rather than a boudoir. Mrs. Voss rose to greet them. A woman of perhaps 50 with iron-gray hair scraped back plainly and hands stained faintly yellow at the fingertips, grinding motion still in the set of her wrist even at rest, as though her body had forgotten how to be still after so many years at the mortar. Your Grace, she said to Marianne, with a small correct curtsy and no trace of the guilty flutter Marianne had half expected. I had hoped to meet you sooner. His Grace was, I think, more afraid of the meeting than I was. I was afraid of what it would mean. Once it could not be unmeant, Julian said quietly. He turned the ring once, closed his hand over it, and for the first time let the sentence finish itself without retreating from the room. Mrs. Voss is an apothecary. Marianne, her late husband trained my father's physician, and trained her besides, better than most men in the trade would ever have permitted a wife to be trained. I sent for her in July, the week after I began to suspect that what was killing me by inches was not grief, and was not any illness the county surgeon could put a name to, but something added, deliberately, to what I ate and drank and swallowed each night to help me sleep. The room went very quiet. Marianne heard her own pulse in it. "Poison," she said. "In small doses, cleverly spaced, the surgeon would never have caught it," said Mrs. Voss, "and I would not swear to it myself. Not yet. Not before witnesses. That is the whole difficulty of the thing, Your Grace. Suspicion is cheap. Proof is not. I have spent 11 weeks testing every dose that reaches him before it reaches him, tracking what agrees with him and what does not, keeping notes no one else may see until I am certain enough to stand behind them in daylight. I could not do that work in the village, where every soul in it dines out on gossip, nor could I do it under my own name, which is known in 3 counties as a physic woman's name, and would have brought exactly the wrong kind of scrutiny down on this house before I was ready for it. A veiled woman installed as a mistress draws one kind of talk. A physician installed to test the Duke's food for poison draws another kind entirely, the kind that reaches the poisoner's ears within the hour and sends whoever is doing this to ground before I have enough to name them. You let the whole county believe you an adulterer, Marianne said to her husband, to keep a murderer from learning you suspected them. I let my own wife believe it too, Julian said, and for the first time his voice caught, however briefly, on something that was not quite composure. That is the part I have not yet forgiven myself. I told myself it protected you, not knowing which servant to trust, not knowing how wide the rot went, but I understand now that I was only doing to you what I most despise being done to myself, deciding, alone, what you were strong enough to carry. I have carried this house's accounts since June with less help than you have just described giving Mrs. Voss, Marianne said, and heard the edge in her own voice, and did not smooth it away. I might have carried this too, had you trusted me with the weight of it instead of the shape of a scandal instead. I know it, he said quietly. I am asking, rather late, whether you will carry it now. She looked at Mrs. Voss's stained fingers, at the neat row of small bottles ranged along the windowsill, each labeled in a careful hand, at her husband's face stripped, for once, of every guard he usually kept over it, and felt something shift in her chest that was not quite forgiveness yet, but was its foundation being laid. Stone by careful stone. Show me your notes, she said to Mrs. Voss. I keep excellent books. I imagine I can be of some use to yours. They worked together after that, the 3 of them, in stolen hours that had to look like nothing at all to any servant who might carry word of them downstairs. Mrs. Voss with her mortar and her careful bottles, testing what could be tested, Marianne with her ledgers, cross-referencing the household's physic bills against the apothecary accounts Lucretia so helpfully continued to supply, hunting for the gap between what was purchased and what could be accounted for. Julian standing watch over both of them, with a stillness that had, for the first time since Marianne had known him, something purposeful in it, rather than merely born. It was Marianne who found the first true thread, on a wet evening in the 3rd week of the alliance, when a column of apothecary purchases refused, no matter how she turned it, to balance against the physic actually delivered to the house. There is a difference here of nearly £4 across 6 months, she said, turning the ledger so Julian could see it by the fire's light, in purchases of a preparation billed only as bitters for the nerves. £4 is a great deal of bitters for one household's nerves, however troubled. My cousin has always managed the physic accounts, Julian said slowly. My father trusted her with it, and I confess I never thought to question a habit I inherited along with the house. Then it is past time someone did, Marianne said, and did not add what she was already privately certain of, that a woman who smoothed her gloves finger by finger when she lied, and touched her pearl when a lie required more weight than usual, had smoothed her gloves and touched her pearl in nearly every sentence she had spoken to Marianne about those very accounts. Mrs. Voss, grinding steadily at the window, did not look up from her mortar, but her voice, when it came, held the flat certainty of a woman who has seen this shape before in other houses. Bitters, for the nerves, is very often exactly what it says it is, she said. And very often exactly what it does not say at all. There is a preparation of certain garden herbs, common enough that any respectable household grows them for other purposes entirely, which taken in large single doses does very little harm, and taken in small doses over months does a great deal. Cumulative, mimicking exhaustion, mimicking grief, mimicking your grace. Very precisely the symptoms his own physicians have been calling a soldier's lingering nerves for the better part of a year. You believe it is in the tonic, Marianne said. I believe, said Mrs. Voss, setting down her pestle at last and meeting both their eyes steadily, that I have tested the tonic 3 separate nights running against a control I prepared myself, and that the difference between them, though slight, is not nothing, and has not once varied in its direction. I believe further that whoever is administering it has grown confident enough in their own concealment to grow careless in their proportions, which is the only mercy in the whole ugly business, because carelessness leaves traces that caution does not. What I do not yet have, Your Grace, is a signed name. Suspicion I have had for weeks. Proof enough to stand up before witnesses, I do not, and until I do, naming anyone allowed in this house is a lit match dropped in a hayloft. It burns the whole thing down before we have gotten what we need out of it. It was a maxim Marianne would carry with her the rest of that autumn, turning it the way she turned every hard truth she meant to keep. Suspicion is cheap. Proof is the only coin that spends everywhere. She did not sleep well that night, not from fear exactly, but from the particular restlessness of a mind that has finally been given real work to do and cannot yet stop doing it. She thought of Lucretia's warm hands closing over her own at their first meeting, the orange flower water, the smoothed glove, the small proprietary satisfaction with which the woman had spoken of accounts she had kept so long she had forgotten they were not hers, and she thought, too, of Edmund Vane, Lucretia's only son, a quiet, awkward young man of 22, whom Marianne had met exactly once, at church, and who had seemed to her then less like a schemer's heir than like a boy waiting, without much hope, to be told what was expected of him. If Julian died without an heir of his own body, the entail ran next to Edmund. It was not Edmund's ambition driving any of this, Marianne judged, turning it over as she had turned every other figure that did not yet balance. It was his mother's arithmetic. Love curdled slowly over years into entitlement, the conviction, common to those who have managed a thing long enough, that management is the same as ownership. She understood that conviction rather better than she wished to. She had, after all, spent 4 months believing that keeping a house's books quietly and well was the whole of the usefulness the world would ever grant her. She did not intend to let Lucretia Vane finish teaching her that lesson by murder. The blow, when it came, arrived exactly as such blows always arrive in that house, quietly at a public gathering, dressed in perfect courtesy. The occasion was a small dinner Lucretia herself had proposed, 3 weeks before the harvest ball, ostensibly to welcome Marianne properly into the family, before the county descended upon Cairo in force. 20 guests sat down to a table lit by more candles than the room strictly needed, and it was over the second course that Lucretia turned the conversation, with the gentle, unhurried skill of a woman who has planned her opening line for days, to the subject of the veiled lady in the East Wing. I confess I have wondered, Julian, whether it is entirely wise, she said, smoothing her glove, to house a companion so openly, when your own dear wife sits at table not 6 feet from her rooms. It does neither lady credit, and I say that only out of love for you both. Mrs. Voss's residence here is a private matter, Julian said, his voice gone very level. The leveling Marianne had learned to read as the sound of a door being shut hard on something. It is a private matter the whole county already discusses over its tea, my dear boy, which makes it rather less private than you suppose, Lucretia said. And here she paused, exactly long enough, and turned toward Marianne with an expression of such perfect sympathy that it took every ounce of Marianne's schooled composure not to flinch from it. Your Grace, forgive me. I only wonder whether you know that this is not the first time. There was a girl, before your marriage, whom Julian kept very similarly, very quietly, in a cottage on the home farm, until the poor thing left the county in some distress. I had thought, when he married so suddenly, that perhaps he meant to leave that pattern behind him. I am only sorry to see I was wrong to hope it. The table had gone very still, the particular stillness of 20 people all suddenly pretending to study their plates. Marianne felt the eyes on her the way one feels weather change, a pressure before the first drop falls, and understood in that instant precisely what was being done to her. Not merely an insult, but a test, staged before witnesses, to see whether the Duchess of Caro would crack, weep, storm from the table, hand her enemies a story to carry into every drawing room in the county before the harvest ball ever came. She set down her fork, squared it against her plate, corner to edge, the small steadying gesture that was hers alone, and let a silence of her own choosing stretch a beat longer than was comfortable before she spoke. How very well informed you are, Mrs. Vane, about a cottage on the home farm I have never once heard mentioned by anyone who actually manages this estate's rent rolls, she said pleasantly. I keep those rolls myself now, as it happens, cottage by cottage, and I find no such tenancy recorded in the last 6 years, under any name resembling the story you have just told 20 guests at my own table. I wonder where you had it from, if not from the rolls. Lucretia's smile did not move, quite, but her hand, smoothing the glove, paused half a second too long on the third finger. One hears things, Your Grace. One does not always trouble to write them down. No, Marianne agreed. I have noticed that the things most worth writing down are very often the ones certain people take the greatest care never to record at all. It was not proof. She knew it was not proof, even as she said it, and she saw in Julian's face, turned toward her down the length of the candlelit table, something that might have been pride, and might have been fear for what such a reply would cost her later, in a house where her enemy still controlled a great many of the ordinary levers of comfort and reputation, but she had drawn a line that evening, in front of witnesses, and she did not regret it, whatever came. What came, 3 days later, was worse than she had braced for. Julian took ill in earnest, doubled over at his own desk with a pain in his chest that sent the household into genuine, unrehearsed panic, and though Mrs. Voss's swift dosing of a counter-preparation brought him back from the worst of it within the hour, it left him gray and shaking in his bed for 2 full days, and left Marianne standing outside his door at 3 in the morning, with her hand flat against the wood, understanding for the first time with her whole body, rather than merely her accounts. Precisely how close the arithmetic of this house had come to costing her a husband she had only just begun, against every plan she had made for her own heart to want to keep. It was in the raw days that followed, while Julian lay weak and Marianne sat the long watches at his bedside because she found she could not make herself leave, that the bribe came. Delivered with Lucretia's usual gentleness on a morning visit ostensibly paid to inquire after her cousin's health. She caught Marianne alone in the corridor outside the sick room, and her voice, when she spoke, had shed every trace of warmth without ever once raising in volume. You are cleverer than I first credited you, Your Grace, and I find I have grown tired of being underestimated by clever women half my age, she said. So I will speak to you plainly, as one manager of accounts to another. Whatever you believe you have found in my books, you have not found enough of it to matter, and you will not find more before the audit. Because I have had 30 years' practice at keeping the true entries where clever young wives do not think to look. What I can offer you is simpler. Support my son's claim, quietly. When the time comes, do not stand in the way of what is. In the end, only the natural course of an old family's fortune, and you shall want for nothing, Your Grace. Not now, not as a widow, not ever. I can make you very comfortable. I am, whatever else you think of me, a woman who keeps her word to those useful to her. And if Julian does not die, Marianne said, very quietly, which I intend to see that he does not, then we shall all have had a pleasant conversation about nothing at all, Lucretia said, smiling, and no harm done to anyone. Think on it, Your Grace. Pride is a very cold thing to keep house with, in a widow's small rooms, on a widow's small allowance, once the title and everything with it has passed to a nephew who never much cared for you. Marianne looked at her a long moment, at the smoothed gloves and the pearl and the perfect, unhurried cruelty dressed as generosity, and felt something in her that had been small and careful for 4 months. For 26 years, straighten all at once like a spine finally permitted to stand at its full height. I find, she said, that I would rather keep house with pride in cold rooms than keep house with silk and silence over a murdered husband, Mrs. Vane, and I think you mistake me badly if you believed that offer would cost me anything at all to refuse. I refuse it. I will refuse it again tomorrow and every day after, until you are made to answer for what you have done, however long that takes, and whatever it costs me to see it done. It cost her a great deal in the days that followed. Lucretia was not a woman to absorb a refusal gracefully, and small cruelties multiplied quickly through a household she had run so long she still commanded loyalty in corners Marianne had not thought to guard, a housemaid dismissed without character on a manufactured pretext, a rumor set loose in the village that the new Duchess herself dosed her husband's food with something to keep him biddable, a letter, unsigned, left on Marianne's own writing desk, warning her that meddling wives sometimes met with accidents on dark staircases. Marianne burned the letter, told no one but Mrs. Pratt, and doubled instead of doubted her resolve. Because she had learned by then, from long practice at her father's ruinous accounts, that a debtor who grows frightened enough to threaten you has generally run out of honest ways to pay. The darkest hour arrived 9 days before the harvest ball, on a morning when Marianne came down to breakfast to find Mr. Trevanion already seated at the table, his face grave, a folded letter before him, and Julian standing at the window with his back to the room, and his hand closed so hard around the signet ring that his knuckles had gone white. "Your Grace," Trevanion said to her, rising stiffly, "I am afraid a most serious accusation has been laid before me this morning, and I am obliged, in my position as trustee, to treat it with the gravity it claims for itself, whatever my private feelings in the matter." "What accusation?" Marianne said, though something cold in her chest had already guessed the shape of it. "That you and Mrs. Voss, acting in concert, have been administering some manner of preparation to his Grace under cover of treating him, for reasons the letter does not scruple to name outright, that you married him for his fortune, found the marriage less lucrative than expected while he lived, and have since taken steps to hasten your widowhood. The letter is unsigned, but it is detailed, Your Grace, and it is accompanied by a sworn statement from a servant of this house who claims to have witnessed Mrs. Voss preparing a compound in secret on 3 separate occasions, and to have been instructed by you personally to say nothing of it." "Which servant?" Marianne said, very steady, though her pulse was loud in her own ears. Trevanion did not answer at once, and did not need to. She saw it in the way his eyes moved, briefly, apologetically, toward the door, where Peter Sims stood with a footman's hand not quite gripping his shoulder, his face bloodless. His cuff worried between 2 fingers until the seam had begun to fray. "I am sorry, Your Grace," the boy said, and would not look at her. I was told it was the truth, or near enough to it, and that no harm would come to you from saying it, only to Mrs. Voss, and that I should have money enough after to leave the county for good." "Told by whom, Sims?" Julian said, turning from the window at last, his voice terrible in its quietness. The boy's mouth opened and shut twice before anything came out of it. "I cannot say, Your Grace. I dare not." "Then you had better learn to dare," Julian said, "because until you do, my wife stands accused of a hanging offense in my own house, on the word of a boy too frightened to name who frightened him." It was Trevanion, dry and precise and entirely without malice, who delivered the true blow, folding the letter closed with the careful finality of a man discharging an unwelcome duty. "I am obliged to inform you both that pending some resolution of this matter, I cannot in conscience proceed with the quarter-day audit as a mere formality, nor allow Mrs. Voss to remain unsupervised in this house, nor, forgive me, Your Grace, it gives me no pleasure to say it, permit the Duchess free access to His Grace's sick room until the accusation is either proven false or answered for. I will require a full accounting before witnesses at the harvest ball itself, 9 days hence, or I shall have no choice but to refer the whole matter to the magistrate and see the estate placed under interim management until it is settled by law." Interim management, Marianne understood, standing very still in the cold morning light, with her husband's eyes on her and Trevanion's letter on the table between them. Precisely whose management that would fall to, and for how briefly it would need to last before an old man's slow poison, robbed of its antidote and its watcher both, finished the work it had begun in the spring. She was escorted from the sick room that same hour, gently, apologetically, by servants who did not meet her eyes, and she stood outside the locked east wing door that evening, with her candle guttering and her whole careful shelter of smallness stripped away from her at last, and understood that there was no more shade left to hide in, no low doorway left to duck under. Whatever was to be done now would have to be done in the open, in daylight, before witnesses who would not look away, and as she stood there turning that fact over like the last hard coin in an empty purse, she heard a step on the stair below, and a folded note was pressed into her hand by a girl she barely recognized, breathless from running, who said only, "From Mrs. Voss, Your Grace. She says you're to read it where no one can watch you do it, before vanishing back down into the dark." Marianne unfolded it by candlelight with hands that had, for the first time in 4 months, stopped pretending to be steady. "I have it," the note read, in a hand cramped with haste. "Not everything. Enough, I think, to begin. Come to me before dawn, and bring your ledgers, all of them, and your nerve besides, for I fear we will both have need of it before the ball." She went before dawn, as instructed, past a young footman Mrs. Pratt had personally arranged to be looking the other way, and found Mrs. Voss not grinding at her mortar for once, but seated at a small table with the leather case Marianne remembered from that first morning open before her, its false bottom lifted clear to reveal a shallow compartment beneath, and within it a scatter of items that Marianne would spend the rest of that dawn arranging into a case fit to be laid before witnesses. There was a silver dosing spoon, worn smooth with age, engraved along its handle with the Ash Grove motto, which Julian's own mother had used, Mrs. Voss explained, to measure physic for the old Duke in his last illness, and which Mrs. Voss had borrowed, with Julian's blessing, to test each night's tonic against a control. Its bowl, examined now under strong light, showed a faint residue in its seam that matched exactly a compound Mrs. Voss had already identified from 6 separate samples taken across 2 months. There was a small brown bottle, twin to the one Marianne had glimpsed beneath Lucretia's blotter that first afternoon, its label torn but its remaining half-word now legible under a glass, as the tail end of a druggist's name in the next county over. A man Mrs. Voss had already written to under a physician's letterhead and received 2 days past. A reply confirming that a woman answering precisely to Lucretia Vane's description, though giving a false name, had purchased that same compound from him regularly across the better part of a year. And there was, most damning of all, a slim account book bound in the same plain calf as the household's official ledgers but kept, Marianne saw at once on opening it. In a second hand nested inside the first, entries that appeared, at ordinary reading, to be nothing more than the tedious record of physic bills Lucretia had always claimed them to be, but which, held close to a candle flame as Mrs. Voss now demonstrated, revealed a fainter secondary ink beneath the first, notes made in a preparation that darkened only under heat, recording dates and doses and, twice, in a hand grown careless with confidence, the words the boy, meaning Marianne understood with a cold drop in her stomach, Edmund, and the timeline by which he might reasonably expect to come into his inheritance. She kept a second book beneath the first, Marianne said, low, the way I might keep a fair copy for company and a working copy for truth. The vain ones always do, Mrs. Voss said, not looking up from her careful repacking of the case. They cannot bear, in the end, not to have the whole cleverness of it written down somewhere, even in secret, even in danger, a kind of pride that outlives caution. It is generally what catches them. What remained was Sim's, and it was Julian himself, informed of the night's findings at first light, and looking 10 years steadier for having something at last to hold rather than merely endure, who went to find the boy before the household woke, and returned an hour later with a confession wrung not by threat, but by the simple offer Julian made him, plainly, man to frightened boy, that whatever Sims had done under duress, a full and honest account given now, before the ball rather than during it, would be remembered by this house as the act of a boy who found his courage late, but found it regardless, while silence kept any longer would be remembered as something else entirely. Sims wept, and told them Lucretia had come to him herself, 3 weeks past, with money and a story half true enough to swallow easily, and a threat besides, that his sister, in service 2 villages over, would find her own place made very difficult indeed should he refuse her. It was, Marianne thought, listening to the boy's halting account with the ledger's second hand still open on the table before her, exactly the shape of every wrong Lucretia Vane had ever done, gentleness offered with one hand, and the other already closed around something soft enough to break. The harvest ball came on a clear, cold evening 9 days later, the great hall of Cairo lit end to end with candles and full, for the first time in years, with the whole of the county come ostensibly to see whether the Duke stood the season out, and in truth to see what would become of the marriage that had scandalized them since June. Trevanion presided from a table set at the hall's head, the household's official ledgers stacked before him, and it was Lucretia who arrived first among the family, magnificent in silk the color of late plums, smoothing her gloves as she crossed the floor to greet guests with the composed, gracious warmth of a woman who has never once in her life been made to answer for anything. She had nearly reached the center of the room when Julian rose from beside Marianne and asked, in a voice pitched to carry the length of the hall without ever once rising to a shout, whether his cousin would do them the kindness of joining the family at the audit table a little early, as a small irregularity in the physic accounts wanted her particular expertise to clarify. The room's chatter did not stop so much as it thinned, every ear in it suddenly, politely. Attending, of course, Julian Lucretia said, smiling, seating herself with perfect composure at the table, though I confess I am at a loss what irregularity 30 years' careful keeping could possibly have produced. Then let us look together, Marianne said, and opened before the whole assembled table the slim calf-bound book with its second hidden hand, and held its first page close enough to a branch of candles that the heat drew the fainter ink up dark against the pale, the dates, the doses, the two damning mentions of the boy rising out of the paper like something surfacing from deep water for every witness at that table to see plainly. The hall had gone entirely silent now, 20 conversations arrested mid-word, and Marianne felt every eye in the room settle on her the way weather settles before a storm breaks, and did not flinch from it, because she had spent 4 months learning exactly how much weight her own stillness could bear. "That is nothing," Lucretia said, and her voice, for the first time since Marianne had known her, had lost its gentleness entirely, gone thin and quick. "A trick of ink and candlelight, easily forged by anyone clever enough to want me discredited, and I wonder, Your Grace, that you should be so very clever with forgeries, given how conveniently they always seem to point away from yourself." "It would be a trick, certainly," said Mrs. Voss, stepping forward and setting the small brown bottle and the worn silver spoon upon the table beside the book, were it not corroborated by an apothecary 2 counties distant, who sold this compound across the better part of a year to a woman he can, if summoned, describe in perfect and unflattering detail, and by residue in this spoon that matches it precisely under any chemist's examination. Mr. Trevanion cares to commission, and by a servant of this house prepared to say, before all of you, from whom his instructions and his silence were purchased. All eyes turned then to Sims, brought forward by Julian's own hand from where he had waited, pale but no longer shaking, at the edge of the room. "Tell them," Julian said quietly, not a command so much as an offering of the last of his own courage, handed over. "It was Mrs. Vane, sir," Sims said, his voice cracking once and steadying. "She gave me the drops to put in the master's tonic each night and money after, and told me if I ever spoke of it, my sister would answer for my tongue. I am sorry for it. I am sorrier than I have words for, but it is the truth, before God and all of you, and I'll say it as many times as I'm asked." Lucretia's composure, held so long and so perfectly, did not shatter so much as simply stop, all at once, like a clock whose spring has finally, silently given way. Her hand, still gloved, came to rest flat on the table's edge. And Marianne saw, for the first time in 3 months of watching that hand smooth silk over every lie it told, that it was shaking. "I did not want him dead," Lucretia said very low, to no one and everyone, only slow. Only slow enough that Edmund might come in to what should always have been his, what his father would have had the old Duke not favored the elder line by nothing but an accident of birth order. I have kept this house running for 8 years while Julian played at grief and soldiering both, and I was never once thanked for it, only tolerated. The way one tolerates a useful servant one does not trouble to see. I only wanted, at the end of it, to be owed something. Her voice broke on the last word in a way that owed nothing to performance, and Marianne, looking at her across the candlelit table, felt something she had not expected to feel that evening arrive alongside her anger, a cold, clear-eyed pity. For a woman who had spent 30 years mistaking control for love and had finally, ruinously, run out of road on which to keep confusing the two. It was Julian who spoke into the silence that followed, and the whole hall seemed to lean toward him to hear it. Because he had not yet, in all the weeks of the unraveling, said what he meant to do about it. "You will not hang, cousin," he said, quietly enough that Trevanion had to still the room further to let it carry. "I have thought a great deal these last 9 days about what justice ought to look like in this house, and I have decided it does not look like a rope, nor a public trial that would drag your son's name through the same mud you have already made of your own. Though God knows you have earned worse from me than mercy. You will leave Cairo before the week is out, for the dower cottage at Hollow's End, 40 miles from here, with an allowance sufficient to live quietly and never generously. And you will not set foot on this estate again while I hold it, nor write to any soul within it, nor attempt to see Edmund except at such times and places as he himself chooses, once he is old enough to choose it freely and not under your roof. That is not kindness, cousin. It is arithmetic. A trial costs this family a scandal it need not pay, and a boy a mother's blood on the county's tongue for the whole of his life to come. Exile costs it far less, and buys, besides, the one thing you never once thought worth purchasing from any of us, a little mercy, freely given, which I find I would rather be known for than known as the Duke who hanged his own kin before a full assembly." Lucretia said nothing for a long moment, and when she rose from the table at last, her composure gathered back around her like a cloak too thin now to keep out the weather it had once turned so easily. She did not look at Julian, nor at Marianne, but at the small brown bottle still sitting on the table between them, as though it were the only honest witness left in the room. "You were always your father's son," she said, so quietly only those nearest the table heard it, kinder than the accounts required. "I never could decide if it was a virtue in him or a weakness. I find, now, that I am glad of it either way." She left the hall with her back straight and her step even, and the county, watching her go, understood without being told that whatever story would be permitted to circulate about that night would not be the whole of the truth, and understood also, from long practice reading the moods of great houses, that pressing for more of it would earn them nothing but the family's lasting coldness. Edmund Vane, who had stood white-faced and silent through the whole of it near the hall's far door, came forward once his mother had gone and knelt, briefly, before Julian, in a gesture so old-fashioned and so entirely unrehearsed that it silenced even the last of the room's whispering. "I knew nothing of it, Your Grace. I swear it before all these witnesses," he said. "I would not have wished this, any of it. I have never wanted the title, only ever wanted my mother to stop believing I did." "I believe you," Julian said, and raised him by the arm rather than let him kneel a moment longer. "And I will not visit her debts on your account, Edmund, provided you do not ask me to visit her back into this house on the strength of your forgiveness of her. Go to Hollow's End if you wish, when the dust has settled, and be a better son to her there than her scheming ever let her be a mother to you. That is the whole of what I ask." It was Honora Blake, of all the room's witnesses, who crossed the floor last, her fan folded still in one gloved hand, and stood before Marianne with an expression stripped, for once, of every ornamental thing Marianne had watched her wear all autumn. "I repeated what she told me," Honora said, low, for Marianne alone. "About the cottage, the girl before your marriage. I did not know it was a lie built to bait you before witnesses. I am not asking you to forgive it tonight. I am only telling you I know now what I did, and I am sorry for it, more than my pride generally allows me to say aloud." "Then let that be the whole of your apology," Marianne said, not unkindly, "and let the next thing you're known for in this county be something better than repeating another woman's poison. I find I would rather have you as a doubtful friend than a certain enemy, Miss Blake, if you're willing to be one." The candles had burned low, and the hall had thinned to family and the household's oldest servants by the time Julian found Marianne alone on the terrace, where she had gone to let the cold air settle what the evening had stirred up in her, and where, somewhere in the dark hedge below, a wren she had come to know by its particular broken little song was still, improbably, singing past its hour. He did not speak at once. He came and stood beside her at the stone balustrade, turning the signet ring once around his finger and then, deliberately, stopping himself, letting his hand rest still and open instead. "I have spent this whole autumn deciding, alone, what you were strong enough to be told," he said finally, "and I find, now that it is over, that I was never protecting you from the truth at all. I was protecting myself from what it would cost me to need you as much as I have come, these last weeks, to need you." "I do not require rescuing, Julian," she said. "I never did. I required only to be trusted with the weight and allowed to choose for myself what I was willing to carry." "I know it now," he said. "I did not always. Will you forgive a slow learner his slowness?" "I keep excellent accounts," she said, and could not quite keep the smile from her own voice. "I find I am willing to extend you rather generous terms." He turned to face her fully then, and for the first time since the church in June, there was nothing careful left in his expression at all, nothing weighed or measured or spent with a merchant's caution. "I am not asking you this because the estate is safe now, or because Trevanion will sign his papers in the morning without a shadow left on either of our names, or because it would look well before the county to be seen loving my own wife," he said. "I am asking it because I find I love you regardless of any of that, and I would go on loving you exactly the same were every one of those safe things stripped away again tomorrow. Marry me again, Marianne, not the cold contract we signed in June, but the thing itself, freely, before whoever you'd like to witness it, because you wish it, and for no other reason than that. It is the only reason I will take." "You forget," she said, though her voice had gone unsteady at last, the composure she had kept through a scandal and a poisoning and a public reckoning finally, gently, giving way, "that I already keep your books. You are asking me to keep you too. I have no secrets left to give you," he said, "only the truth, which is worse than the secrets in places, and better in far more of them. Keep me anyway." She did. They were married a second time on a bright cold morning 3 weeks later, in the small chapel at Carow rather than the county church, before no more than 20 witnesses, Mrs. Pratt weeping openly into a handkerchief she had clearly brought for the purpose, and pretending afterward that it was only the cold, Mrs. Voss standing near the back in a plain gray gown, with her stained fingers folded correctly before her, Edmund Vane present at Julian's own invitation and looking, for the first time since Marianne had known him, like a young man permitted at last to simply exist without an inheritance hanging over every word he spoke. Peter Sims stood among the household staff with his collar straight and his cuff, for once, entirely still. The wager book at the village inn, Mrs. Pratt reported afterward with some satisfaction, had been quietly and unanimously closed out that same week, every wager paid in favor of the marriage surviving, and the innkeeper had stood the winners around in the Duchess's honor without being asked. Honora Blake sent a small, carefully worded note of good wishes, and was, within the year, engaged to a widowed baronet 2 counties over, a match Marianne heard of with genuine and uncomplicated pleasure. Edmund took up residence that spring not far from his mother's cottage at Hallows End, near enough to visit her when duty called him to it, and far enough that duty was never mistaken again for anything owed. Lucretia Vane lived out her exile in a silence the county eventually stopped speculating about, her name spoken less and less each season until it faded, as most scandals eventually do, into the kind of story only very old servants remembered accurately. Mr. Trevanion completed his delayed audit within the fortnight, found the household's true books, kept faithfully now in Marianne's own steady hand, in such immaculate order that he told her, with the closest thing to warmth his dry manner ever produced, that he had rarely in 40 years of trusteeship seen estate's accounts so honestly kept. It was almost a year later, on a bright morning near the ball season's turn, that Marianne stood once more at the gallery window with a ledger open on the sill, watching not trunks go up a locked stair this time, but her own small daughter, not yet a year old, carried past the same window in Mrs. Pratt's arms toward the nursery that had once been the coldest, least used room in the east wing and was now, by Marianne's own particular order, the warmest room in the whole house. Julian came to stand behind her, his hand closed not around his ring now, but around her own, and below the window, in the hedge that had never once in a year stopped its small persistent singing, the wren began again its broken, hopeful little song. "A house does not lie," Marianne said softly, half to herself, watching the light move across the lawn the way it had moved on that first terrible morning, when 6 trunks had gone up a stair and every certainty she owned had gone up with them. Only the people in it do. "Then I am glad," Julian said, low against her ear, "that I finally stopped being one of them. And if this story warmed you, if you found, somewhere in a house full of locked doors and misread silences, the particular relief of watching someone finally trusted with the whole truth instead of only the safe half of it, then stay a little longer by this fire with me. I keep a chair here for exactly this kind of listener, a candle lit, a kettle always somewhere near the boil. Tell me, if you would, which moment stayed with you longest, the trunks going up that first cold morning, or the wren singing on beneath a window that had finally stopped needing to be afraid. Stay close, keep your place by the hearth, subscribe, if you'd like to be here the next time I tell one of these, and until then, be gentle with the quiet ones in your own house, the ones who keep the books and rarely ask to be thanked for it. Sleep well, and keep your own small lamp lit for whoever still hasn't found their way home to it.